My name is Caitlin Beckett. I am a prosecutor with the Secure Section at the Attorney General's office. I've been with that office for a little over 2 years. Prior to that, I did defense work and victim advocacy work. And as was stated in law school and post-grad, I did a lot of work dealing with human trafficking, working one-on-one with human trafficking victims, and research into the sort of protocols and evaluation tools that are used to put together the International Trafficking in Persons report that comes out. It's supposed to be annually, but doesn't always come out annually. So today we're going to be talking about screening human trafficking cases. So here's our table of contents. It's kind of a timeline. If anybody's like me, they're very type A and like to know where they're at in a presentation and how close they are to the end. Feel free to take notes on that so you know when I might stop talking, but no promises. As a human trafficking prosecutor, one of the main concerns and main issues I bump up against is the perception of what human trafficking is and what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. I use a very dated reference, so I've only recently been told that it's dated, which is Liam Neeson's Taken. To me, that reference will always work. But what we see in human trafficking is not reflected in that particular film, right? Human trafficking isn't just somebody shoved into the trunk of a car and driven across state lines, but that is often the public perception of what human trafficking has to look like. I bump up against this with not just defendants and defense attorneys, but oftentimes judges will have that same interpretation, and it offers me an opportunity to educate judges and the public as to what it looks like, right? The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, this is pretty straightforward language. Again, this myth of human trafficking. What are some of the common myths that we see, right? We think that there has to be this imagery of forced slavery, of physical violence, of physical restraint. That's a big one. Physical restraint. We actually a lot of times don't see a lot of physical force and a lot of physical restraint initially when it comes to our human trafficking cases. Here's some of the top myths that I've come across. Human trafficking doesn't occur in the United States. Human trafficking victims are mainly poor immigrants. Human traffickers physically restrain their victims. Those are some of the images we saw before. Human traffickers use physical violence to kidnap their victims into human trafficking. Human traffickers must transport victims across state or national borders. Victims of trafficking are only women and young girls. Victims of human trafficking will seek help when in public. Victims of human trafficking see themselves as victims. Victims of human trafficking have disdain for their traffickers. Victims of human trafficking will readily leave their traffickers if given the opportunity. If any of you work on domestic violence cases or child victim cases or interpersonal violence cases, the same myths appear in those cases as we see in human trafficking cases. We know that there's oftentimes a deep personal connection between a victim of trafficking and their trafficker. We see grooming, we see manipulation, we see a lot of those same patterns that you would see in for lack of a better word, sort of traditional domestic violence cases. These are just some numbers. These are from 2019. But this is the reality of human trafficking is that it's occurring. It occurs here in the state of Utah. It occurs in your backyards. It occurs in rural areas. It occurs in metropolitan areas. Your victims are going to be across the board. We see victims in the agricultural world tend to be older men. We see juveniles who are in touch with the juvenile justice system or DCFS. And we also see homeless populations. We do see poor and immigrant populations as well. Here's some individual risk factors for who's more likely to end up or most likely to end up as a victim of human trafficking. When we refer to runaways or throwaways, whether these be adults or even children, Again, those in touch with the juvenile justice system or in foster care, those who identify as a sexual minority, those who have a history of being victims of domestic violence, those with mental health problems or mental health concerns, and displaced persons. Poverty, homelessness, substance use, sexual abuse and assault, child abuse or neglect, and individuals already engaged in commercial sex. That last one is one that we see quite often, and one of the more common defenses that I see in those cases is, well, this particular individual was already engaged in commercial sex, therefore they can't be a victim of human trafficking. No, your traffickers are unfortunately intelligent when it comes to who they are able to manipulate and who they target. So if you have somebody who's already willing to engage in commercial sex, there's definitely somebody out there who's willing to financially, personally benefit from that, no question. What are our three main types of trafficking here in Utah? Adults in commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. Minors in commercial sex. There's no need to prove that they are engaged in commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. It's a first-degree felony if you engage in human trafficking of a child for sexual exploitation. Adults or minors in labor services via force, fraud, or coercion. It's our human trafficking statute. We look at this through an actions, means, and purpose model. So, recruits, harbors, transports, provides. Those are some pretty broad words, right? The human trafficking statute has very broad language in it for this exact reason, because we see different methods, different modes, different manners in which people can be brought into human trafficking. The means, force, fraud, or coercion. Again, minors engaged in sexual exploitation. We don't have to prove that force, fraud, or coercion. And the purpose is to get them to commit a commercial sex act or engage in labor services. Again, human trafficking of a child for labor, similar to the adult statute. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here for a second, because one of the number one things that I've come up against, because I'm lucky enough to be a resource for other prosecutors, and I oftentimes get phone calls that go, yeah, I've got a kid who agreed to do this particular sex act, and they received drugs in exchange for that particular sex act, but they didn't get the drugs. Or they agreed to do this particular sex act, but they didn't get the money. And they weren't forced to do it. They sought it out. They wanted money. They were on social media. Doesn't matter. That's human trafficking of a child, right? That's a first-degree felony. I've seen different variations of this. Again, this is a scenario where there's no mistake of age defense here, right? So if you have a defendant who says, oh, well, I know she was 17, but she told me she was 18. Doesn't matter, right? And I don't have to go before a jury or judge and say to them, well, he knew she was this old. We have this particular exchange where he knew or she knew how old the child was. This statute is unique. And I have had multiple conversations with defense attorneys that go somewhere along the lines of, my client was maybe not the greatest, and he might have financially benefited, but she benefited too. At which point I then say to them, are you looking at 308 or 308.5? And there's a long, drawn-out pause, which is then usually followed by, let me call you back, or I'll talk to my client. Because there is this significant difference between the adult trafficking statute and the child sex trafficking of children statute. How to identify force, fraud, or coercion, and how it is used to traffic vulnerable individuals. This is where I find the best opportunity when it comes to my cases to educate judges and the public. We do not have a significant amount of case law in Utah on what this looks like. We do have some very baseline language in the statute itself, but there is a broad section of the statute that allows us to look at a particular situation between a trafficking victim and a trafficker. And if we can show that there is a pattern of dependence and a pattern of exploitation or a relationship where one person is dependent or actually exploited by a trafficker, the statute is broad enough that we can see an opportunity to sort of show people, hey, trafficking isn't always physical violence, right? It isn't always somebody who would never have done this, or somebody who, who we would see as a quote unquote perfect victim that has no background issues, no concerns, nothing like that. So that includes individuals who have a history of substance use. Individuals who maybe don't speak the language, they do come from a foreign country, right? Or individuals who are maybe living with their trafficker. Individuals who are related to their trafficker. Individuals who are dope sick, who are going through withdrawals. If you have a victim who is going through withdrawals and a trafficker who is providing them with drugs, and when they refuse to engage in labor or commercial sex, and your trafficker says, well, I'm your main source of drugs. If you don't do that, I'm not giving you you're not getting your heroin. I'm not giving you anything. We see that quite often, right? This is the invisible rope of power and control. And I skipped right past it because what it's pointing out is this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I often apply this when I'm discussing child victims, because a lot of our child victims we do see have had contact with mental health services, JJS, DCFS, and come from somewhat troubled backgrounds. And if you have a kid who doesn't have love and affection at home, who doesn't have their parents, who is in foster care, who has a background of kind of being what we refer to again as that throwaway kid, and you've got a trafficker who says, hey, Gidla, you want some food? You want someone to pay attention to you? You want someone to talk to you? Oh, you want a cigarette? Let me get you some cigarettes. We've seen that in a lot of cases. Kids are a lot easier to manipulate in this scenario because we have these already vulnerable children who don't have some of those basic needs. And if you've got a trafficker who's adept at identifying that and profiling a victim, it's really easy to target and manipulate just those base level needs when it comes to children, right? Trauma bonding. I'm assuming I'm going to do a teacher thing because I used to teach. How many of you are familiar with what the trauma bond is? Raise your hand. I can tell some people who were like A students, like, thank you. Dan Strong in the back. So a trauma bond, we see this in so many of our cases, which is this idea of very basically here, a real or perceived threat, and there's these perceived small acts of kindness from the abuser. You've got a kid who's homeless, right? Nowhere to go, living on the street, terrified. Abuser says, I've got a hotel room. You want to come stay in my hotel room? And it becomes, hey, we still need a hotel room, you know? The only way we can continue to have a hotel room is if we make some money. How are we going to make some money? Well, I've got an idea. Okay, what's that idea? Engage in commercial sex. You can make us some money. We can stay in this hotel. Okay, I'll look out for you like you looked out for me. And then you have a victim who thinks that they are being helped, who thinks that they are being taken care of, who thinks that they are being protected by this individual, right? And that's when they become even easier to exploit. If you don't see this person, this trafficker, as exploiting you, you are more likely to engage in the conduct that they're requesting of you because you think they have your best interest at heart. Those of you that have ever been involved in a domestic violence case from any perspective or have any knowledge on what domestic violence looks like, Here's the question you never ask. Why don't they leave? Why do they go back? We know why, right? Decades of research, decades of psychological studies. There's a lot of reasons that somebody may not leave an individual who is exploiting them. Some of those base level needs, if you have nowhere to go, can you physically leave home? If you have no food, you have no job, you have children you're trying to care for. Or what if you just flat out love that person and they're exploiting it? Right? We see that all the time in domestic violence cases, and I make this argument a lot in my adult trafficking cases, the sex trafficking cases, and in labor trafficking cases. So we have a couple of red flags, pages about red flags, right? You may see some of these, you may not see any of them. In terms of our labor trafficking, we see a lot of individuals who, in the state of Utah, our labor trafficking is quite often agricultural. You have individuals who are brought in through the H-2A or H-2B visa program, and they come to our state and they work in agricultural services, sheep herding, ranching, all of that, right? So they don't speak the language. They aren't aware of what their rights actually are in terms of what they can be asked to do and not asked to do. These are very general. I'm not going to read through all of them because even I don't like the sound of my voice that much. Okay. Special considerations for prosecuting these kinds of cases. I've given you kind of a yes.
Let me just ask a question before you move too far past that. I know that Shondell was pretty significantly narrowed a few years ago, but it seems like these statutes are so broad that they're kind of inviting Shondell claims. Have you seen that, and how do you deal with it?
Don't we just apply Shondell to everything at this point? There are a lot of claims in terms of the overbroadness of the statute, right? Because our statutes are actually, our human trafficking statutes in Utah are not that new. But there's not, I have yet to bump up against it. I hear the argument a lot, but I have not personally seen it be successful. I feel like Dan Strong wants to answer your question as opposed to ask one, so.
Well, I feel like a few years ago, maybe somebody who did the case law will take it remind me, but there was a case that overruled Shondell, right?
I don't think it overruled it, it just narrowed it. That's what it said.
Yeah.
I feel like this is kind of still being right into the narrow view. It was just as narrowing, I think it was millions, but it.
Yeah, I also think there's a line in the trafficking code that says it's specifically that it's chargeable in addition to other offenses or something, so I think you should be good. I could be wrong about that.
Dan and I have talked at length about the potential overlap between the trafficking statute and the exploitation of prostitution statute, or the aggravated exploitation of prostitution statute, because we're awaiting that particular issue to pop up, right? It's, that it could be problematic down the road. But I will say that our trafficking statute is though it is broad, it's mirrored in federal language and it's mirrored in a lot of other states. And there are actually other states that, I want to say Massachusetts is one of them, where you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, even for adults. So, in our trafficking cases, obviously, we know we're going to hit vulnerable victims. I'm talking to the perfect crowd for this, because you guys are like, I know, we hear about this all the time. Victim engagement is huge. You cannot, I have yet to see a successfully prosecuted human trafficking case where a victim was not on board. The closest I think that I have seen is what, if Ryan were here, he would be all about this part, but what we refer to as our hybrid cases, which is a lot more of what we're seeing now is solicitation of minors online through social media and Facebook. And God bless our defendants who are very thorough and very specific and fail to delete, or under the impression that when they do delete, it's no longer recoverable, because social media is a gold mine. And for whatever reason, people think that stuff is not going to come back to bite them, and it universally does. So if I have, a minor victim being solicited through social media, through Facebook, through Instagram, through Snapchat, and I've got those text message exchanges, or I've got those videos, we have a lot of cases where minors are being solicited to provide nude photos, nude videos, a lot of sexually explicit imagery. If I've got those written communications and it's clear to me that the production of those images or the production of those videos or the request for a sex act is in exchange for any item of value, then I have a human trafficking case, right? Those are becoming more and more common. But if you don't have that, if your trafficker wasn't nice enough to write down all of his requests and his manipulations, then you have to keep your victims engaged. And we know that our population of human trafficking victims are more likely to be vulnerable. They don't have a general trust of law enforcement. They don't have a general trust of anybody. And a lot of them actually have a significant degree of attachment to their traffickers, right? So we have to build trust with our victims. In every single one of my cases, I always tell my investigators, before I'll charge your case, I want a CJC interview of the child or a written 1102 statement from a victim. And I do that because I know as soon as I file charges that I'm going to have a victim who's flip-flopping, right? Who not recanting, but doesn't want to be involved, loves them. I don't want to do this. I'm scared. I've got my own issues, or, we've gotten their services and they've gone into rehab, and then suddenly it's, I don't want to go to rehab. I'm not prepared for this. Turned my whole life upside down. I can't do this. If I don't have a written statement and I've just got a no bail hold on a defendant, I know I'm having a prelim 2 days later, because that's what's happening in all of our cases. I'm dismissing a case, and I don't want to do that. But I know that if I can show a victim that I'm staying in contact with them, that their case is successfully moving forward, that I've got a better chance of either resolving the case through plea or keeping them on board through trial, right? I mean, that kind of goes across the board, but I'll tell you, in every HT case I've done in the last 2 years, when I've asked for a no bail hold on a defendant, I've received it. And then almost immediately I get my request for a detention hearing and my request for a prelim, that the judges are just kind of going, we're just going to do this. They haven't asked for it, but we're just going to do it. And I've only had 2 of those defendants actually waive their prelim. So the HT prelims seem to come up pretty quick when you do charge HT cases. So again, keeping your victims on board and being aware of where they are. We have a wonderful victim coordinator in our office who is great, and she will reach out to victims any time of day. We have a decent amount of resources for victims in our office, which is great. We're able to, get them to rehab, send them to get housing. Some of them need basic medical care, things of that nature. So we're able to keep them engaged that way, which is great. But at the same time, if you've got a victim who's in and out of rehab, contact is great, but what's going to happen as your case moves along if all you've got is a sort of, are you still on board? Yeah, I'm still on board. Where's your victim at? Did your victim leave the state? Is your victim currently clean? We also, with our labor trafficking cases that deal with migrant labor, we've made a lot of contact with local consulates. One hiccup I run into quite often is that our migrant labor workers obviously are not always going to be native English speakers. So I get to go through the wonderful challenge of having those translated, whether it be an interview of a victim, and then having to go back and sit down with that victim and have them go through a transcript, or have them, write out their statement, sign it, and then get it translated. So it doesn't always go in my favor, but I always request that we try to avoid doing probable cause arrests on HT cases, because you can probably see how that gets really chaotic. If you arrest a trafficker on probable cause and then you're trying to dump all your information together after the fact. If you do have cases where no matter how much contact you've had with your victim, they're not going to stay on board, the great and terrible thing about human trafficking is that, should have segued this earlier with this question, there are always alternate offenses, right? Human trafficking cases are resource intensive. They're difficult to prove. We know the court process can be difficult. As prosecutors, we can sometimes acknowledge that maybe you pulled a judge who's not going to understand where you're coming from, right? Who maybe isn't going to see the case the same way that you do. Or you've got a particular defense attorney that might make things slightly more problematic. So we look for these alternate charges. Traffickers tend to engage in a lot of crime as part of their trafficking enterprise, right? In my labor trafficking cases, or even in some of my massage parlor cases, I can charge money laundering. If I've got a big enough human trafficking operation, I can usually charge money laundering. Aggravated exploitation of prostitution is another one. Aiding and abetting prostitution. Done some tax fraud, document fraud, identification fraud, just general exploitation of prostitution. Pattern of unlawful activity is a nice second-degree felony if you're looking for somebody who's engaging in providing drugs, is caught with a decent amount of drugs, is caught aiding prostitution, dealing in solicitation, firearms offenses, drug possession offenses, sexual exploitation offenses. Again, if Ryan were here, he'd probably give you guys about 10 minutes on what some of these look like, so I'll give you the brief version, which is a lot of our juvenile cases, you will find dealing in materials harmful to a minor and child sexual abuse material, right? Because what happens is these traffickers seek out these minors, and a lot of the ways that these minors are exploited is online, and they are sold, right? We know that this occurs online. It used to be Backpage, and they'll upload these images that are very clearly sexually explicit, and you find out after the fact that they're minors. Those are second-degree felony child pornography charges. Here's an important one. Safe harbor for victims. So safe harbor is a common concept in a lot of states, but in the HT world, it's the idea of treating your victims as victims. We know a lot of our victims engage in criminal behavior, right? We know a lot of our victims engage in prostitution. We know a lot of our victims probably have substance use issues. They'll probably have outstanding warrants. If you have adult victims who are homeless, if you have adult victims who already have issues with substance abuse, you'll probably find that some of your victims may have pending warrants. They may have criminal justice contact in their background. But here, arresting a trafficking victim will destroy their trust in our judicial system and in law enforcement. Instead, the way we try to handle these cases, if they're adult victims, is we refer them. We refer them for services. If it's a child victim, we refer them through DCFS. There are unique services to each victim. Obviously, we have, for our immigrants, we have a lot of resources available, contact through consulates, continued presence visas, T visas, U visas. Those are broad options when we have immigrant victims who come forward and say, well, my trafficker said if I say anything, I'm going to be sent back to my home country and without the money that I came here to make, and I'm terrified, right? Well, I am not an immigration attorney. I will tell you that right out of the gate. I will never claim to be an immigration attorney, but we have a lot of great immigration attorneys here in the state of Utah who welcome the opportunity to either do pro bono or low bono work for victims of trafficking. The statutory provisions for child victims, safe harbor. A child cannot be charged with sexual solicitation for engaging in commercial sex. I've used this in a jury instruction. I've used this in argument. You have a defense attorney who wants to say, oh, the kid was out there prostituting themselves. No. adults were exploiting a child who was engaged in survivable behavior, right? Survivor sex, going out there trying to make money, trying to take care of themselves, but we don't charge them, right? So if I get to say to a jury or to a judge, that's great. I hear the argument. This is a child, this is a state. We've decided this child can't be charged with that particular conduct. It's not a relevant argument. I've got a case study for you guys, but I'm wondering how fast I can talk and whether or not Dan Strong is willing to do the rap that Ryan Holton was going to do.
Yes, please.
Sweet. Okay, so Todd Rettenberger. Yeah, I'll just give you guys a minute with that. Todd's a special guy. Todd obviously had some very lofty goals and was successful at mostly none of them. Here is Todd's criminal history prior to the case that we in our office ended up charging him with. Manslaughter, possession of a controlled substance, attempted aggravated exploitation of prostitution, money laundering, and exploiting prostitution. In this case, he ended up being charged with 2 counts of human trafficking, pattern of unlawful activity, 2 counts of aggravated exploitation of prostitution, obstruction of justice, tampering with a witness. You see 2 counts of human trafficking, there's 2 identified victims, 2 counts of aggravated exploitation of prostitution because there's 2 victims. I don't know who he got to take all these photos of him, but they are all equally ridiculous. And he is way more of a stereotype than is probably necessary. So this case started out, there was a task force officer connected to Bountiful that asked the Attorney General's office for help. They were at a standstill with one of their cases, and they were attempting to locate this particular parole fugitive, star of our story, Mr. Todd Rettenberger. They interviewed family, friends of the first identified victim in this case. Here's how our case started out. Again, real high-class individual, Mr. Rettenberger. Here's the key steps to how the case was investigated before it was brought forward for prosecution. These are pretty similar to how we do all of our cases now, which is talking to our victims, checking out social media, checking out online ads, doing cell phone warrants, everybody's bread and butter in here, I'm sure. And then looking into his criminal history, he had that criminal history that involved aggravated exploitation of prostitution and exploitation of prostitution, so we knew that he'd done it before. What is our action, means, and purpose for this particular case? So he dated the victims in this case. He met them through work. He transported the victims to engage in commercial sex. He did, in fact, take them across state lines. He advertised and solicited people to engage in commercial sex with these victims. He was their drug supplier. He did threaten them. He did engage in acts of physical violence and physical force. Though, again, that's not necessary. And his entire purpose was to force them to engage in commercial sex so that he could financially benefit and keep buying those ridiculous shirts. That last part might have been creative license. February 2016, he's arrested after a traffic stop in Idaho. He's driving a rental car from Oregon, and there's an adult woman in the vehicle with him. This is a great opportunity for law enforcement, even if he didn't have a parole violation or a pending warrant at that point. The story is consistent across the board with how he recruited his victims, which is he'd engage in a romantic relationship with them. If they were trying to get clean, or even if they weren't clean, he would then become their supplier. And then he would physically abuse them and force them to engage in commercial sex. Again, the background of our victims: vulnerable, history of substance abuse, history of mental health issues, a history of emotional and sexual abuse. Met Mr. Rettenberger through her boyfriend. became her heroin supplier, and then Rettenberger says, hey, come work for me. So she ends up working for Rettenberger for a very brief amount of time. But again, it starts as a second-degree felony, not a first. We don't have to prove that it happened for a continuous period of time. It could have been a one-off, though oftentimes we don't charge those. There is an incident that occurs with her family where the family tries to convince her to leave him, and she's unwilling to leave. The victim's unwilling to leave, right? We know that. We see that all the time. And she tells her grandparents, I think you just got us killed. I think you just got us killed. That's pretty clear. She's terrified of him, right? So he convinced victim 1 to go to Oregon with him, demands she work while they're there. She calls her grandparents to come pick her up. Rettenberger gets violent and tells her she has to make back what she owes him. We all know she doesn't owe him anything, right? But he's bought the hotel rooms, he paid for the gas. It's his car, you owe me. She hops on a Greyhound and comes back to Utah. Victim 2, same story, romantic relationship, became a drug dealer, supplied her with heroin, abused her, convinced her to work for him. History of commercial sex as a juvenile, heroin, methamphetamine addict, victim of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. She needed the money. Rettenberger promises her a 50-50 split, but never gives her any of the money. Again, fairly common. He has an escalating pattern of physical violence with this particular victim, which includes engaging in rough sex, forced sex as punishment, puts his hands around her throat. She is raped by a John, and he just sits there and does nothing. Rettenberger frequently mentions his criminal history in his prior manslaughter case. You talk. Done it before, I'll do it again. Right? Rettenberger makes the victim get a tattoo of his pimp moniker after she disrespected him. Tells her if she is arrested, don't say his name and delete her phone. Which again is a lot of times why some of our trafficking victims have contact with law enforcement, is that they're engaged in criminal conduct, and whether they're out there engaging in commercial sex or drug distribution or getting drugs or any of that, and they don't immediately say, I had a trafficker, I didn't do this, because they've been taught not to. Again, you're going to have a lot of social media, phone evidence. We get hotel receipts in a lot of our cases. Backpage is no longer a thing, but again, there's still, law enforcement has access to a lot of databases that can pull do some sort of facial recognition. My tech skills are limited, which is again why they wanted Ryan here. But they do pull, whether it's the same contact information, same location, same verbiage that's used, but a lot of this software can identify victims on websites advertising commercial sex. Rettenberger did have a rap video. I did not bring the rap video because I was anticipating Ryan doing the rap for you guys. He was not aware of that, but he was going to do it. Again, screening for prosecution, human trafficking of adult victims requires all of these things we've gone through, right? What evidence do we have that supports it in this case? How did he control his victims? He used drugs, he used violence, he used all of the things that are on this hierarchy, right? Love me, I'll provide you with drugs, give you a place to stay. Exploiting all of that. Again, that invisible rope of power and control. Psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, demeaning and degrading. Love and affection, that was a huge one, right? He became their romantic love interest. He's not exploiting me, he loves me, he's looking out for me. Exploited their drug addictions. Though there is no state case law on this, I've argued multiple times in front of the court that being dope sick or addicted to drugs is a vulnerable state that we get to use as part of our analysis, is whether or not somebody is being forced or defrauded or coerced into engaging in commercial sex. Again, he would talk about his criminal past, right? Like he was super proud, possibly because it's the only thing that Todd Rettenberger had ever been successful at was committing crime. And that's probably going to be true for a very long time for him. He would rap about the game. I won't read this, though, deep down inside, I really want to. This is some of the lyrics that he wrote on a note that was found on his phone, and there's also a video of him doing this exact rap. This is great evidence, right? You can't jump up in front of a jury and say, man, this is just creative license. It's pretty specific to the pattern of behavior that he engaged in and what his intentions were, right? I didn't intend to exploit anybody. Oh, that sounds pretty exploitative.
It's important to know he was terrible at rapping too.
Yeah, I think the fact that, I'm pretty sure that's like clear from those early photos, but Dan is correct. He was not the future of hip hop, or the past, or in any way, shape, or form connected to actual musical endeavors. Again, implied threats. Isolating victims. Escalating pattern of violence. This is, again, for lack of a better term, a sort of classic, right? Recruit, befriend, manipulate, convince them to engage, and then to keep them under his control, use any means necessary. Exploit the connection, exploit the substance use and substance abuse and substance addiction, exploit the mental health concerns. I oftentimes see cases where traffickers say, hey, I know your kid's in DCF custody, I'll help you get clean and get your kid back. What parent wouldn't say, that's awesome, that's great. And that usually lasts about 2 to 3 days before it's, okay, I'll just give you a little bit of heroin because I can tell you're dope sick, but then you got to pay me back for it. Or if you don't want to pay me back, here's how you can pay me back. Here's that language I was telling you about, right? A pattern of behavior intended to cause a person to believe that if they stopped work, they would suffer serious harm, physical restraint, or abusive legal process. There are a bunch of other force, fraud, or coercion elements that are outlined in the statute. Ultimately, he was convicted. This particular case is a pretty straightforward trafficking pattern. Again, our victims are not, our scenarios are not always that clear, right? But this one it's pretty clear, it's pretty straightforward. We do see different forms of this. Yes, Mr. Barlow in the back, did I talk too fast?
No.
It's okay. Okay.
Meter is fine.
Sweet.
The pattern language, that allows you to get a series of acts in as intrinsic evidence as opposed to having to go through 404B. Is that correct? Can you get those objections?
It can. A lot of times your judges, there's a separate subsection of that statute that talks about a pattern of behavior or creating and exploiting a relationship of dependency, which is broad enough that it will allow you to go down that 404B road as long as you have a judge that is following you in that analysis. We all know what 404B should look like, but it's not always uniform across the board. But yes, traditionally that's what that particular portion of the statute does. I talked a lot faster than I thought I would. So here's some of the resources that we have before us. I answer phone calls. This is probably a terrible thing to admit, but I do answer phone calls and emails 24/7. And I'm always more than happy to hear from whether it's other prosecutors or law enforcement or literally anybody who says I have a fact pattern that may or may not involve human trafficking or exploitation of prostitution. Either I would like your help or can I just ask you questions, right? nobody in our section turns down those kind of phone calls. I do turn down weird requests where somebody's like, hey, will you come talk at my school group about QAnon? And then I just tap down. Next email, please. But whenever we get phone calls from prosecutors, we get phone calls from law enforcement. Our investigators in our office are wonderful at working with other PDs, and I like to think I'm good with people. I don't know if I've been lied to about that. I'm sensitive, so people might not tell me if I'm terrible. But I love receiving those phone calls. I love receiving those emails because I would rather be able to say to a prosecutor, you have a great case, or you don't have a case, than have them go, no, I don't think I want to go down that road. That seems too difficult. I would prefer to be a resource. I recently got a call from a prosecutor who initially had a case charged as a Class A misdemeanor and wanted to dismiss the Class A misdemeanor. And I don't know if this is like something I should be sharing, but I am. And by the end of our conversation, she was like, oh, I'm just going to refile this as a first-degree felony. And I was like, yeah, that works, actually. That works. That does work. So it's reflective in the growth of human trafficking. We do, no question, see it all throughout the state of Utah. It's becoming more common throughout social media and popular culture, but it happens in ways that people may not be familiar with. So if you have a fact pattern and you look at it and you say, this feels like human trafficking, but I'm not sure if I want to charge that because I might be opening up Pandora's box, call Dan Strong. Because he will answer your phone calls as well. He still answers mine when I go, hey Dan, I have a question. And then he's like, oh God, I should have changed my number when I left the Attorney General's office. It's too late, Dan. But our section is tiny. We've recently co-opted Maria into our unit, so we're very happy to have her, but it's me, it's Ryan Holton, and now the wonderful Maria, but we are more than happy to answer questions, field concerns you have about your cases, tell you whether or not you're feeling crazy, and what you may be dealing with in terms of specific defense attorneys who tend to jump onto these types of cases. I will not say names or point fingers, but we do have some that tend to jump on certain types of cases. Can I answer any questions? If the answer is no, I'm so happy to sit down. Wonderful. I finished early. Ryan will be sad that he didn't get to wrap. I'll leave this up for a second. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time.